Hello and welcome to this second in a series where we're taking a look at Surge, the free synth. So in this particular part, we're going to look at the filters. There's so much to look at with Surge that it would be a 2-hour long video if we did everything all in one go. So in this video, we're looking at the filters and a brief explanation. The audio on this may not be as good as normal, and that's because it's currently incredibly hot here in the UK. So I've got the window open and the door open because I'm melting, frankly. And I live near a main road, so if you can hear traffic in the background, many apologies, but there we go. Anyway, let's start taking a look at Surge's filters. So here you can see I've loaded up the init patch. It's a great starting place, so if you're not sure about that, you can just go under templates and then init saw, and everything's set as it should be. Yeah, we've just got a sawtooth playing pretty much, but it sounds good. And as you'll know, hopefully, from watching other videos on the channel, that's what we need if we're going to be playing around with filters, because we need lots of harmonics, etc. So there are two main areas to concern yourself with the filters. So we've got this area here, which is where the filters live, as it were, and where you can select them. But we've also got a filter envelope generator, which we're going to look at briefly. And there's also the filter configuration here. So this default setup here is in stereo, so we've got some feedback, but the main thing we've got is this line across the top where we've got stereo through filter 1, we've got the Waveshaper, filter 2, and then an amplifier, and then finally this high pass filter, and off we go to the output. So this is what we're going to look at by default, because we can just straight away start listening to the sound of the filters. Now, we've got two filters. We're just going to start with filter 1. They both do the same thing, but we've got quite a selection, as you can see here. And this is one of the really great things about Surge, because you've got so many filters to play with and different implementations of what are nominally the same filter, that you can actually hear the sound of the filters, which I think is really good if you want to get a grip on how things actually sound. So enough of my yakking. Let's just start off. Standard 12 dB filter. We can hear with the cutoff here, you can hear the effect of it, and you can just, you get the idea. So if you've not done this kind of thing before, then this is ideal for playing around with, but just play around with cutoff and resonance. As ever, be careful with resonance and your listening level, because this really can boost the signal. So if you're not careful with this and you start playing around with this, if you've got your speakers up really loud, you might do yourself a mischief. So just be careful on that. But we can hear the effect of resonance there. I'll turn it up even more. And I say this is great because we can then go for low pass 24 and hear the difference. You can hear that stepping as I move the control. Whereas you get a different sound from the 12 dB. But importantly, we've got a whole load of other ones. You can hear the sound of vintage ladder, what that sounds like. And in fact, here with this top note, we're getting nothing out of that really to speak of and listen to. You can see we're just getting a tiny bit of waveform there, but there's... So it behaves in quite a different way. We've got bandpass filters, which are really useful for filtering, giving you a really harsh robotic sound. We've got something we can come back to later on. High pass filters, again, and some implementation of the OBXD filters as well, because they are a contributor. The creator of that has contributed to Surge, so they've given these filters, which is a really cool thing. Notch filters, so kind of the opposite of a bandpass filter, band reject effectively. So we can see that notch moving through the frequency analyzer on the right hand side. And finally some effect ones as well. So all pass is quite an interesting one. It really changes the phase of the tone above and below the cutoff frequency, but we can also see, if I turn the resonance down, we can also see it does affect the waveform. So there's some interesting things happening with the phase relationships between all those different harmonics. And other than these, I quite like the sample and hold one because this has got some real gritty. So we start off with that. It's not really doing anything, but as you bring the frequency down, look at the oscilloscope on the bottom right, we can see it's getting more and more stepped. And it's sounding more and more glitchy. So you got access to some interesting sounds just from that. So there's a quick look at some of the highlights of the filters there. We could go through all of them, but it would take half an hour just to do them any kind of justice. So there's lots to experiment with. So if you only download Surge for one thing, I would play around with the filters, because if you're not sure of what the difference is in sound between 12 and 24 or some vintage types like the vintage ladder, etc., then you can get to experiment and just change this part. So it's a bit like having a modular synth and you're just changing one element, the filter in this case, and leaving everything else the same. And it's dead easy to do. It's much easier to do than in any modular synth that I've come across. So next up, let's take a look at what you can do with two filters at the same time. Surge has two filters, and as we can see from this list, they are identical. So they've got the same choices here. But what's really useful about this is, firstly, you've got two filters to play with. So if you want to do something extreme, so let's say we got low pass 24, let's put another low pass 24 on here, and then let's put them in series. So I've changed to S1 here just so it shows it's totally simple. So F1 goes into F2. And if you put them to similar settings, you can do that manually, or what you can do is you can click this here and then that links this together, and there we go. We've gone for full-on crazy. So we can get some really extreme effects by putting them in series and then effectively putting them to exactly the same settings as each other. But as you can see from this button here, you can link their resonances together, which can be really useful. This button here is equivalent to a link. So this is allowing you to link the cutoff frequency here, but you can have an offset. So with it turned off, or rather with it set to 0, we're using both these controls here to control both of them, so we can... But if you want to offset it, we could offset it by, let's say, an octave. So let's set that to 12 semitones, and now it's an octave up. So we get quite a different sound from that. Now, obviously, you're not limited to using the same kind of filter on filter 2 as filter 1. So we could pick perhaps a different kind of low pass, or let's try a high pass. So let's try a 24 dB high pass. And there we can see we've got a real severe band there. And again, because we've got a 12 semitone offset, we're just getting that one octave there. If this was set back to 0, we could set this one to lower. So let's just set that to -12. And then we get a wider band, etc. And now getting some very early robot speech from the 1930s kind of sound there. The Voda, I think its name was. And quite a few other combinations. So obviously you can use these to your heart's content. Now, another thing you can do is you can change the balance. So let's just release these back to normal. And you can switch between filter 1 and filter 2. By default, the balance is set to 0. So it's even, but we can go just to low pass. Or just to high pass, and anywhere in between. So with some careful playing around, you can get some good balances between them. if you want to just accentuate one particular style of filter or switch completely. And as we'll see later on with the modulation section, you can then automate that or control it and have all sorts of interesting things going on. So far, so good with the filters. Now let's take a look at the filter configuration, where you can change the relationship of the two filters and how they filter or feed into each other, etc. So we've got a number of filter configurations here, which is reasonably unusual for a non-modular synth, but it's quite handy. So the default, what we saw was the stereo filter configuration here, where we have this stereo path all the way through, and S1 kind of does the same thing but removes the feedback. S2 adds that feedback in, and S3 puts F2 in the feedback loop. So let's just take a listen to some of the differences here. So really the main difference between S1 and S2 is that the feedback comes into play. Now, depending on your filter settings, the feedback can lead to the filters pretty much self-resonating. So in this case, if I go negative enough, you can hear, even though I'm actually changing notes on the keyboard, the filter's frequency is what we're really hearing. And if I move this, it sounds like the sounds from the science programs I used to put on when they wheeled the TV into your classroom when I was a kid. So pretty wacky stuff, but with some more. And if we go positive, you see we get a more sort of formant sounding tone, but it's the negative ends up with the feedback pretty much as soon as we go over there. But this changes that. Now, in S3, F2 is put in that feedback loop, so it's not going to be having the same effect. And you can hear now we're getting much more of a kind of clavinet kind of tone. And let's just unleash. And we can hear now, if we really wind F2 up, we can start to get it feeding back. And if we go crazy, we can also deafen everybody on YouTube. But yeah, so you can hear that that's got quite a different effect because it's working in that feedback loop, and the effect of it, no pun intended, is significantly different. But D1, okay, so in D1 they're in effectively in parallel. So we can put maybe high pass in one. Let's just turn that resonance down. So you can hear, you're hearing the high pass there, and you're hearing that. I'm just going to turn the feedback back down. But again, we do have feedback to play around with. So you can hear we're getting a change in tone. It tends to make, say, it nearly always sounds a bit like a formant, as long as we don't go too far with resonance, etc. And then in D2, the main position difference is we have, in D1, we have the sum before the Waveshaper, and in D2, the Waveshaper is just after filter 1. And that brings us neatly onto the Waveshaper. So for the Waveshaper, I've turned the filters off, so you can hear we're just back to Sawtooth land. And now the Waveshaper here, so this is sort of pushed out of the way, but it's here between F1 and F2, but there is no F1 or F2 at the moment. So we're just going to hear the effect of that and see the effect of it. So if we put it on soft, you can see as we increase it, look at the shape of that sawtooth changing. So you can see it's changing, and this one is much more severe. So it's heading towards square wave territory. Asymmetric. So we can see that's changing. In fact, I'm just going to change the gain of this section just so we can see it a bit better. So now we should be able to see that a little bit better. So you can see that asymmetric is quite different to the hard and the soft. And we've got sine, which is an interesting one. So we start with our normal tone, and as we go above the 50% mark, the sine takes over. And then finally we've got digi, which again is reminiscent of the sample and hold filter, but it effectively allows you to quantize the signal you've got and give you those sounds a lot like sort of console synths of the 90s and probably 80s as well. So the Waveshaper can be pretty useful, and it's certainly quite a useful creative tool to have in there. Next up, key tracking, which can be pretty useful if you want your tone to be musically playable. So sometimes you want your filter effect to just stay the same regardless of what's happening musically. Other times you want the filter to be a part of a musical note. And when you play a different note, you want the filter's frequency to change. That's key tracking, if you didn't know that. So the key tracking on Surge is nice and flexible. So let's take a quick look at it. So the key tracking section is here, and the main thing is we have a note, which is our center point for key tracking effectively. And then we've got how much the key tracking happens. So we can see we can go up to 100% where it will follow perfectly. And we can go to minus 100% where it will go in the opposite direction. So let's just reset that to 0 at the moment. Let's set up a low pass 24 dB. Now, if you right click, the handy thing is we can get reset filter cutoff to key track root, which puts you back to a good starting position. And we know that that is at C4. And we'll put resonance up a fair bit. So now when we play that, we can see we're getting some boost there. And if I move the cutoff around, you can see it's highlighting, and you can hear it's highlighting that harmonic, then the next one, and so on. So let's just reset that back to the key track root. Now, if I play different notes, you can hear they sound different. So like that B, nearly an octave above the first note, because it's not going to be anywhere near one of the harmonics, it's pretty quiet compared to the C below. And they're the same volume initially, but the filter is just cutting it out. Now, if we put key tracking on and do that same thing, let's play that same scale, each note has the same musical effect, which is often what you want when you're not making kind of sound effecty kind of filtering. So if you're doing things such as, you know, filter sweeps, etc., you probably don't want key tracking turned on. But if you're deciding to create a sound which you want to play and you want it to be consistent, key tracking is generally what you want. Now, what's nice is we've got separate key tracking for each filter. So if you want one of your filters to key track and the other one to not do that, you can do that really easily. It's not just, sorry, the Hells Angels have just decided to descend upon us. Yeah, as I was saying, this allows you to set the key tracking separately on each one, which is quite a nice touch if you ever want to do that kind of thing. The last thing is, at the end of this, we've got this high pass filter here. And again, we can take that up, and you can see that goes up to a reasonable range. Let's just turn key tracking off, and let's put this out of the equation totally. And then bring this up, and you'll see the bottom end will disappear. And you can hear it. So if you've got any low frequency artifacts, etc., knocking around after all your filtering, or maybe the envelope, etc., is carrying things beyond where you want, the high pass filter can save the day, which is again another useful little bit of Surge. And say it's all these little things add up and make it into a really great little synth. Next up, let's take a look at Surge's envelopes, which are surprisingly simple. So we've pretty much skipped over this, but we've got a fairly standard, pretty much standard ADSR. It's just got one nice little touch here, which we're going to look at. So firstly, let's just set up a sound where the filter will actually be heard. So there we go. And now if we want to send the filter envelope to it, we can just do this. So we've got a positive. So we can hear that's going up and then coming back down, etc. You know, pretty standard stuff. But what's nice about this, because we've got two modes, we've got digital and analog, and in analog mode they've got this sort of exponential curve in all the changes, whereas if you're in digital mode, you've got initially a linear change, but you can actually change them. So you can pick convex or concave. So you can either do it from the context menu, or you can click in the different place, left to right. So let's say you've got a long, you can hear the difference in that quite easily, and that's pretty useful to have. So being able to have control over these curves individually can be pretty useful. Say you've got control over the attack, the decay, and the release time individually. You've also got control of each filter in terms of how much it's sent, and interestingly it's calibrated in semitones, which can be pretty useful, and you can make it go positive like that, or you can make it go negative, which generally needs a different cut-off to be remaining in the audible frequency range, but you can get the idea. And then it pops back up once the attack and the decay are over. So finally, a look at the ring modulation mode for the filters. So ring here, you can see we have F1 and F2 in parallel, and then they are combined with a ring modulator. Now, a ring modulator gives you the sum and difference of two signals. So if you just change this initially, not that much to notice here at this point, but firstly, if you wind the feedback up or down, we get a breakover point where suddenly it gets interesting. But aside from that, changing one side and not the other. So let's just put on a low pass 24 and then play around with this. Now you get a little bit of a change, but the thing I've found that makes some more interesting changes is having one of the filters being modulated by the envelope generator and one of them not. So in this case, let's make filter 1 move. So depending on the relationship between the notes you're playing and the cut-off, etc. Let's just turn on some key tracking. We get some vaguely FM-like sounds in the background. Let's turn the resonance down a bit. So depending on where you are with this, you can get some So the most of the things I found playing with this sound a bit like a bad FM synth, but there's probably a good technical reason for that. But there's plenty to experiment with this though, because obviously you've got all these settings on both filters and the envelope generator and key tracking, etc., and also feedback as well. So there's not infinite possibilities, but there's certainly a huge number of them to play around with in this section. So there you go, a fairly brief tour, I think, of Surge's filters and their many facilities. So if you're not super confident with synthesis, programming, etc., or you're not sure about the sounds of different filter types, I think this is a great way of learning what those different filters sound like, because it's easy to just go, oh, low pass filter, but even just the differences between a 12 and 24 dB filter aren't always immediately apparent on some synths, And having access to different types of the same filter, so different kinds of low pass filter, different kinds of high pass, etc., and hearing those where just those change, I think is really useful for giving you an idea of A, how old synths worked in many cases, and B, the creative potential for using different kind of filters in different kinds of situations. There's just so much to this. It's immense. You could spend weeks and weeks playing around with just the filter section and the different configurations and the way you can manipulate it. Talking of manipulation, in the next video, we will be looking at the incredibly useful and deep modulation section. But as ever, I hope you found this video useful. And if you have, please like and subscribe. And we'll see you again soon for more Music Tech Tuition.